What makes Sakamoto Days look this good? It's been around for a while and fans agree it has some of the best looking action and jump. Action that even rivals that of Jujutsu Kaisen. And yet the manga's never really been that big, meaning most people haven't even read the manga, never mind heard of the upcoming anime. Which is exactly why I'd like to examine everything about Sakamoto Days' peculiar art style, discuss some of its more underrated elements that even the biggest fans never talk about, and explain why this story has some of the best looking action out of any manga. Just be warned that while not on purpose, this video will likely contain some spoilers. Now let me make a brief comparison again to Jujutsu Kaisen. When it comes to the action in Jujutsu Kaisen, you'll see the term JJK paneling thrown around. There's a lot of good examples, but the best ones come out of the Gojo flashback. Now that, together with the great choreography, make the action great. But in the case of Jujutsu Kaisen, it's pretty balanced between those two elements. As someone who has read most of Sakamoto Days, it does not have anything on the level of JJK paneling. It has some great paneling for sure, but in the case of Sakamoto Days, the action is less because of the paneling and more because of the choreography, as well as one other factor, but I'll make sure to bring that up again later in the video. If you read the first chapter of Sakamoto Days, it becomes pretty clear exactly why the paneling usually isn't that crazy. Shonen manga fall in this weird gray area of comedy and action, and they all kind of find different balances. JJK definitely had some comedy, but it was mostly action. Sakamoto Days, on the other hand, is the other way around. For example, Chapter 7 follows Sakamoto and his family as they go to the amusement park. It starts out with some cute scenes, but slowly transitions into a more serious tone where the gang is being attacked by assassins. And yet, even in this second half of the chapter where there is plenty of action, the paneling is still pretty conventional. It's not all squares and rectangles and it flows well, but the thing to keep in mind isn't how 3D you can make the characters look outside of the panels or how you can blend the panels together. That's part of it, but the overlooked foundation of paneling is in the subject of one panel to the next. And when you follow each panel in the action scenes, it's action to action just like you'd expect. Now, let me be clear. I don't say this to come down on Sakamoto Days. In fact, you'll see why I love the paneling in just a few seconds. But I just want to be clear that it's not the paneling that makes the action great, because people have a tendency to just call everything paneling, when there's really a lot more that goes into it. That being said, there's plenty of examples of where Sakamoto Days pushes the boundaries. One example you can see early on comes in Chapter 12. Here, Sakamoto kicks Boiled, and to start, series creator Yuto Suzuki transitions from the previous scene by cutting to the floor of this next scene, then immediately to Boiled getting the shit kicked out of him. And he emphasizes the speed in this scene, 1, by making this harsh transition from the floor to Boiled, and 2, by drawing Boiled in between the two panels so that the action feels even more abrupt. In this way, Suzuki doesn't just draw Boiled in between the borders to make this page look cool. It has the deliberate effect of making the transition into this scene feel harsh and abrupt, demonstrating Suzuki's proficiency in paneling. Again, paneling isn't the biggest part of why the action looks so good in this manga, but as you can see even in the early chapters, it's definitely a contributing factor. But more so than the paneling, one element that consistently makes the action amazing is the choreography, something that very few manga can do quite like Jujutsu Kaisen. But before I say more on that, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. Anyway, I've seen Sakamoto Days compared to John Wick more than a few times. Now, would I say that's a fair comparison?
Yeah.
A big part of why I love John Wick so much is because the director gets into the nitty-gritty of the action. There are times where John rushes through scenes, but most of the time you'll focus on the same fight for 5 minutes while he and some other characters go through the whole dance of fighting each other. And the reason Sakamoto Days feels so much like John Wick is because of how it does the same thing in its own choreography. Like any manga with great choreography like Jujutsu Kaisen or Naruto, Sakamoto Days takes the time to illustrate each small step of the fights. You can see this in chapter 29 when Kashima and Sakamoto jump above a train. Kashima traps Sakamoto, you see him get tied up, then slammed against the rails, then dragged along the rails. Or in chapter 30 when Sakamoto punches Kashima in one panel, then you cut to Kashima, then to Sakamoto, then you cut to Kashima, then to Sakamoto, then to Kashima shooting Sakamoto. Whereas other manga might cut out a lot of these panels to deliver the same basic message, Sakamoto Days takes the time to show you the whole sequence. In turn, you get to see Sakamoto do all of these crazy things like get dragged against train tracks or punch a guy through a door. As a result, you get a completely different reading experience from something like, say, Bleach. In Bleach, the action scenes are very detailed, but the sequencing is kinda non-existent compared to most manga. Meanwhile, Sakamoto Days feels like you're watching a movie, and as you can see, the choreography is a big deal. But remember earlier in the video when I said there's something more important that doesn't get talked about enough? Well, paneling and choreography are great in Sakamoto Days, but those aren't what makes the action scenes unique. The reason these scenes feel so real isn't because of the sequencing. It's actually because of the detail in each individual panel. It's easy to look at a character like Sakamoto and think, oh well, of course Sakamoto Days has a cartoony art style. But when you really look at it, I mean really look at it, Sakamoto Days is actually a fairly realistic looking manga. An easy way to see this is to ignore the characters and focus on the scenery. When you look at this panel from chapter 17, you'll notice that Suzuki does an incredible job of making this shot look real without feeling flat. You get the building taking up the foreground to add to the sense of depth. And with the exception of the simple sky, the landscape of buildings is pretty detailed. Yet, when you look at Heisuke in this panel, he looks much simpler. That's because what Suzuki does is contrast the characters by making them look simple relative to everything else. In this case, he does it for all of Heisuke, but this is typically done by just stylizing the faces of the characters. When you look at a character like, say, Shin, he's actually a fairly realistic character if you just ignore his face. The way I would describe the style of character designs in Sakamoto Days is something like this. Detailed bodies, simple faces. As far as the faces go, they all follow basically the same structure. A small face with little features, all except for two big eyes. By doing this, the characters can look realistic yet still very much stylized all at the same time. Now, what does any of this have to do with the action? Well, part of what makes the action scenes so good in Sakamoto Days is how detailed they are. For example, if we skip to the end of chapter 17, we get this spread here. And notice what I mentioned before. Sakamoto, Shin, and Heisuke still have these simple faces, but everything else is detailed. The simple faces allow us to keep track of and focus on the characters, while the detail in everything from the clothes and weapons makes the action feel visceral. But something else that makes this scene feel visceral is the perspective. Part of what makes the panels in Sakamoto Days so great isn't just the level of detail. A big part of it is also the angles at which Suzuki draws the characters and scenery. One great example that you always see getting hyped up is this spread from chapter 38. And notice the perspective we're given as readers. This could have been drawn directly from the front of the car or just straight from the side. But Suzuki draws the car at an angle so you can see what the inside of the car looks like as it's cut up from basically two angles at the same time. Plus, he draws it in a way where the focal point of this panel draws your attention right to where the car is being sliced. Everything about the perspective is just so elegant in a way where you as the reader get everything you possibly can out of this scene, all without crazy paneling or choreography. And this is just in the early parts of the manga. As the story goes on, Suzuki only gets better. For example, if we skip to chapter 144, you can see in this panel how the two characters look as if they're two giants fighting between skyscrapers. But actually, they're fighting between two smaller buildings built to scale in a diorama. But because of the deliberate perspective in this scene, you feel as if the action in this scene is so epic that it's tearing apart an entire city. You can also see a great example on the following page when you see this great kick. And while we're on this example, one final note I'd like to make is that among the many great things you can find in Sakamoto Days, body expression isn't exactly one of them. Don't get me wrong, the choreography is amazing, but you also don't really get the level of body expression you would find in, say, One Punch Man or Dandadan, where it feels like the characters are always doing poses. That being said, you can see some great character expression on the covers, which in my opinion makes them some of the best looking volume covers ever. But on that note, that's what makes the action in Sakamoto Days so amazing. The paneling is good, but it's not the entire reason for the action looking the way it does. The choreography is great as well, making the story feel similar to all of the great action movies. But what really makes Sakamoto Days stand out so much is the insane attention to detail. From the way weapons and scenery are drawn while still retaining the unique style of characters, all the way to the insane perspectives and angles that really make this manga come to life. It's because of this fluid motion and incredible detail that Sakamoto Days has some of the best looking action scenes out of any existing manga. But now I'd like to hear what you think. How would you describe Sakamoto Days' art style? How does it compare to other manga? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like to join me for more discussions like this one, then make sure to check out my live streams every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday. In those live streams, I react to new chapters as well as share my thoughts on other anime and manga topics. Also, make sure to check out my playlist with other anime and manga art style videos, which you can find linked right here. For now, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.